so when it comes to Calvinists, what some Calvinists believe is this, that if a baby dies, then it was obviously not God's will for them to believe on Jesus Christ and get saved. And so every baby that dies ends up going to hell. Some Calvinists believe that.
But can you imagine serving a God that has little infants in hell right now screaming for their mama, and they have no hope, and forever they're going to burn in hell? And there are people in religion, I say it draws kooks, it draws insane kooks. There are people in religion that believe babies are burning in hell right now.
Now listen to me, and I want you to pay close attention here. Original sin is a false doctrine. You put that in your stupid traditional Protestant pipe and smoke it. Original sin is a lie out of the pit of hell.
Hello, this is Jeff Dollar. I'd like to welcome you again to another episode of The Other Side. Today I'd like to look into a somewhat sensitive and controversial issue, as you've probably already seen. This issue is the idea of infant salvation. And what do Calvinists actually believe concerning infant salvation? This is a very controversial and emotional issue. I remember teaching a Bible class, going through a Bible study, probably 20 or 30 years ago now. I think it was 25 years ago. And the issue just came up in a Bible study, and we were talking about that. And I just happened to make mention of the fact that because of the sin of Adam, that is original sin, that God has the right to condemn infants. I didn't say that he actually did condemn infants, but theologically speaking, we're trying to work through these things. And I had a lady just absolutely go crazy on, no, that is impossible. And the idea is that it is very, very sensitive. You know, my own mother lost a baby before I was born. I have an older brother who was stillborn. And a few years ago, before my mother passed away, we went to the gravesite. And I just thought it would be just a typical visit, you know, that my mom had not been there for a very long time. And she broke down weeping. Here we have a lady that is in her 70s, weeping over something that had happened 50 years earlier. It was the loss of a baby. So this is a very sensitive issue, especially when it comes to children. I'd like to examine three different areas of this controversy. It's going to take more than one video, probably two videos. The first issue is that we need to be careful about allowing emotionalism to dictate doctrine and theology. You know, that we ought to base our doctrine solely on the Scripture, and we'll get to that. Secondly, what do Calvinists actually believe? That the doctrine of original sin, which we do believe, requires that if a baby dies, that it goes to hell because it did not have the opportunity to be saved. Now, do we actually believe that? I'd like to look into that. And also the theology behind these accusations. You know, what is the error that causes people to, first of all, to accuse Calvinists of these things? And secondly, why is their thinking the way that it is? We'll get into that probably in the next video because it's going to be somewhat of an in-depth look into the doctrine and theology of infant salvation. First of all, emotionalism. Emotionalism should not be the basis of doctrine. Now, once again, I can understand the difficulty of this topic. You know, I remember as a very young man, as a senior in high school, I had left the public school system and was attending a Christian school. And for the very first time, I had been confronted with the abortion debate. You know, I blissfully lived most of my teen years. Abortion became illegal in 73, I think it was. I graduated in 79, so this would have been either 78 or 79, where I had been confronted with this issue of abortion. I didn't even know that abortion existed. But once I saw this film that was put out by some Christian group, I just broke down weeping. As a young man, as a senior in high school, and one of my friends consoled me. You know, I was weeping uncontrollably, thinking that in my country, that people, that in America, people would murder babies the way they did. That really affected me. So once again, this is a very, very emotionally charged issue, but we must be careful not to make that the basis of our doctrine. Babies are humanly speaking, the most innocent and helpless among us. So we don't like to think about these things, but we have to look at it scripturally. And we have a natural affection for infants and for babies, and this affects our thinking. However, we have to be careful that this doesn't control our thinking when it comes to Scripture. Our idea in doctrine must always be controlled by the Scripture and the Scripture alone, not by emotionalism. Now you see that Mr. Lawson is really, in his example, is very emotionally upset about this, and again, it is an issue that that does lend itself to that. But we must not allow emotions to dictate doctrine. The reason for that, if you look at liberalism, for example, liberals will point to fundamentalists, to those who believe the Scripture, and say that we worship a brutal God. When you go to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 6, here's what it says. But of the cities of these peoples which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, and the Canaanite and the Pezerite, and the Hivite and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God has commanded you. And we know, of course, what happened. Joshua went into the promised land, and Joshua killed everything that breathed. That included men, women, children, and infants. That's a very harsh thing. Of course, these people were under the prescribed judgment of God, and that's why this occurred. But people look at that and say, oh, that's cruel. How could I possibly believe that God would be like that? And then you have, again, with the flood. If you go back a little further to the flood, what happened? We had perhaps millions of people existed at that time, and the judgment of God fell, and everything that breathed except for the family of Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives were the only ones that survived. That means that not a single infant was spared during the flood. That just goes to show the depth of God's wrath against sin. So again, we have to look at the Scripture, not at emotion. And then you look at Saul. When Saul was commanded to attack Amalek, let me just read here, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Now go and attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. There's no doubt that in the Scripture, many harsh things were commanded by God. God had his reasons for that. So, that we must be careful that the Scriptures dictate doctrine and not emotion. Now, look, with that in mind, what do Calvinists actually believe concerning this issue of infant salvation? Do we really believe that all babies are going to hell, or as some have said, we'll get into this perhaps next time, Hyles-Anderson has said that the doctrine of original sin was devised so that we can baptize babies. Is that really the case? What do Calvinists believe? There's a wide variety of opinion on what exactly happens with infants. And you'll find in the fringe parts of any group, you're going to find different ideas. But when you get into the mainstream of Calvinistic thinking, what are the conclusions that many have come to? Well, let me just read some quotes from some of the older men. These are men of the past. Charles Hodge, he was a 19th century theologian. I have some of his works, his theologies. He was at Princeton Seminary. He had this to say about infants. He was a leading light among Calvinistic thinkers. All who die in infancy are saved. This is inferred from what the Bible teaches of the analogy between Adam and Christ. The Scriptures nowhere exclude any class of infants, baptized or unbaptized, born in Christian or in heathen lands, of believing or unbelieving parents, from the benefits of the redemption of Christ. John Newton. Perhaps you've heard of John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace and many other of our hymns. In a letter to a friend he wrote, "Nor can I doubt in my private judgment that infants are included in the election of grace. Perhaps those who die in infancy are the exceeding great multitude of all people, nations, and languages mentioned in Revelation 7:9, in distinction from the visible body of professing believers who were marked in their foreheads and openly known to be the Lord's." That was John Newton. Loraine Bettner, he was a theologian from the 20th century. I have a few of his books as well. Calvinism extends saving grace far beyond the boundaries of the visible church. If it is true that all of those who die in infancy, in heathen as well as in Christian lands, are saved, then more than half of the human race up to the present time has been among the elect. Charles Spurgeon, another very famous Calvinistic minister. It has been wickedly, lyingly, and slanderously said of Calvinists that we believe that some little children perish. Those who make the accusation know that their charge is false. I cannot even dare to hope, though I would wish to do so, that they ignorantly misrepresent us. They wickedly repeat what has been denied 1,000 times, that they know is not true, or what they know is not true. I know of no exception, but we all hope and believe that all persons dying in infancy are elect. And John Gill, who was, I believe, Spurgeon's predecessor, he was a Baptist minister. I think I have some of his commentaries as well. I've referred to them in the past. They who have fallen asleep in infancy have not perished. We have never taught the contrary. And when the charge is brought, I repudiate it and say, you may have said so, we never did. And you know we never did. If you dare to repeat the slander again, let the lie stand in scarlet on your very cheek, if you be capable of a blush. We have never dreamed of such a thing. With very few and rare exceptions, so rare that I have never heard of them except from the lips of slanderers, we have never imagined that infants dying as infants have perished, but we have believed that they enter into the paradise of God. Pretty strong language to people who lie against us and say that we believe that infants perish in hell, as has been pointed out. Now there are some theological problems, and that's what I'd like to cover in the next video. Original sin, contrary to what Mr. Anderson says, is a genuine doctrine. It is the truth. We are born with Adam's sin, with Adam's corruption. We'll get into that in the next video. I'd like to spend some time on that, so I won't have time to do it here. That does pose a little bit of a problem. What about these babies? How are they saved if they do have this taint of sin? Well, part of the problem is this. The salvation of infants, according to them, is an impossibility because the infant must do something to be saved. Calvinists don't believe that. We don't believe that you do anything to be saved. God is the one who saves. But in Arminianism and in these folks' way of thinking, a person has to exercise faith to produce regeneration. And since that's the case, well, these babies can't do that, so then these babies must be going to hell. Well, we'll cover that with the next video just to show that there are some issues here that need to be dealt with theologically, and that's one reason why they think that way. Their method of salvation does not allow for infant salvation because that the work of man, the hand of man has to be in it in some way. Man's will has to be exercised in some way. So then in closing, I'd like to take a look at this one more video of a person slandering the Calvinistic position, slandering a Calvinist, a particular Calvinist, and then showing what that Calvinist actually believes. And there's a few other videos of Calvinists, what they actually believe. I'd like for you to view these videos and come to your own conclusion. Do we, as Calvinists, generally speaking, believe that infants die and go to hell? Now there's people on the fringes, as there are in every group. But generally speaking, the mainstream, the leading lights of Calvinism, do they believe it? No, not whatsoever. It's another lie, another slander put out by men who hate the doctrines of grace, who hate the idea that man can't have a hand in saving himself. So view these closing videos and come to your own conclusion. And once again, let me thank you for your time, and may the Lord bless you in your search for truth.
Now, the Calvinist, and this is pretty much going to be about Calvinism, is where I have an issue with when the fact that all I have to do is ask a simple question. How many babies go to hell when they die? Now, there are very popular theologians today that believe that there are some babies that go to hell when they die, that they were predestined before the world began to go straight to hell when they die. And one person in particular is John Piper. So you can say hashtag John Piper is an idiot.
I think babies and imbeciles, that is, those with profound mental disabilities, don't have access to the knowledge that they will be called to account for, and therefore somehow, in some way, God, through Christ, covers these people. So that's in a nutshell why I think all children who die in infancy are elect, and that they will be, through Jesus Christ, saved in ways that I may not know how, as God honors this principle of accountability.
Through human history of human beings have been conceived and died before they ever reached a condition of accountability. Before they could ever understand law and grace and sin and salvation. Before they could ever consciously reject the truth. What is their eternal destiny? Well, the Scripture weighs very heavily on the fact that they are received into heaven as redeemed souls to live forever with God.
Die for us. Do we really think that he's going to take an infant or a baby who has been ripped to shreds in his mother's womb from an abortion vacuum, that he's going to send that child to hell? Does that sound like God's character and nature to you? Ability, which, by the way, provides protection for people who are mentally retarded, that God wouldn't cruelly send them to hell when they don't even have the ability to respond to the gospel. Could we agree that a better term regarding what happens to babies who die, we could joyfully announce they go to heaven because they haven't reached a level
his
of
baby
accountability.
died. And so I do believe that God includes in his saving grace and applies the blood to a miscarriage. And so when there is a miscarriage, then where does that child go? I think that we should have the comfort of knowing that God in his mercy and grace, built upon multiple passages, and Dr. MacArthur can pull many of those together for us here, that one is numbered among the elect and is in the Lord's presence